Okay, welcome back, and good evening, or whenever you're watching this lecture. Today is the third session of our lecture series, and the last one before the actual election next Tuesday. 5 more days, and I guess most of us hope that it's not going to be 4 more years. Because if it's 4 more years for him, then it's going to be a lot less years for the rest of humanity, eventually. I may be a bit too pessimistic here. Anyway, Sieglinde Lemke is going to introduce us to one more factor which we haven't talked about so far, which is decisive for the problematic situation at the moment, not only in the United States, but most of the capitalist countries in the Western world, and one of the factors that may ultimately help decide the presidential race as it is. Sieglinde Lemke has been at this university since 2005, starting her career originally in Constance with a master in history and English, going on to the Free University of Berlin, where her doctoral dissertation was on reconsidering modernism, cultural hybridity, and American art in the early 20th century, and then the habilitation on the enigma of the vernacular. In Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, their eyes were watching God and so far from God. And she was working there with one of the most important and most highly reputed professors of American cultural studies that we've had in recent decades, actually, Winfried Pflug. After 2 years as guest lecturer, or during which he was guest lecturer at Harvard and Wheeler College in Boston, and years as an assistant professor at the John F. Kennedy Institute, the Free University of Berlin, she became professor of American Studies, American Literature, here in Freiburg. And one of her research areas, research fields, and the one that qualifies her particularly to speak to us about this subject is poverty studies. She had a fellowship from the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies on the subject in 2010-11, and then a grant from the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft about representations of poverty in contemporary America, which ultimately then piked in a book, Inequality, Poverty, and Precarity in Contemporary American Culture, New York, Palgrave Macmillan, 2016. Sieglinde, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Welcome to all of you, wherever you are right now. This is indeed a decisive point in American history, whether it will be a turning point or business as usual, same, or worse. That is for all of us to see in the near future, that is within the next 5 days, or in 5 days, we will know about the outcome of the presidential election. In my talk, I want to focus on those 2 factors out of the many that are important and that play a significant role for what is going to happen on Tuesday night. So let's begin with the state, one of the battleground states, that is maybe the one that will decide over the outcome of that election. And you might know that poor Melania, in spite of being sick, had to go there today to push her husband's agenda because Philadelphia is so crucial. With its 20 electoral votes, its the most significant of the three major battleground states. So Michigan, the other one, has 16 electoral votes, and Wisconsin, 10. Now, the reason why Trump won last time has a lot to do with winning Pennsylvania. And he won by a very slim margin. And this very achievement, amongst others, other states that he won over, brought him to the White House, as we all know. So Pennsylvania could tip the scale next week. Most pollsters collecting polling data, and here I'm relying particularly on Real Clear Politics, which I think is very reliable and doing good work, have Biden ahead in Pennsylvania with 50% of likely voters behind him compared to 45% of likely voters supporting Trump. So that can change within days, hours even, in these times of COVID and precarity. And we also know from hindsight about the outcome of the 2016 election that pollsters can go wrong, as all major pundits and people giving us an assessment in October 2016 didn't predict the outcome. So what happened in Pennsylvania is that Trump won by 0.3%. That is exactly 44,000 votes. And thereby, he could turn the previously Democratic-dominated state into a Republican state and pocket all 20 electoral votes. Why was that possible? Well, I can imagine that you have an answer to this. Maybe you are also familiar with the argument that I'm sharing now. It was precisely his appeal to white lower and working class voters that allowed him to take that state. I mean, it's not the only reason. Yes, there are other segments in the electorate, electorate versus electoral votes. So other social segments that also play a big role, such as age, gender, etc. But for the sake of the argument, and not only for the sake of the argument because it's my topic, but because the numbers support this, that if you now see the slim margin and ask yourself why that is, here is the breakdown, and the most significant, maybe outstanding aspect here is that among white voters without a college degree, 64% voted for Trump, while 28% voted for Hillary. That's 2/3 for Trump and 1/3 for Hillary, roughly. So out of that segment that voted for Trump, the so-called education, or some people also refer to it as the diploma gap, correlates with the class gap. So it's not just the degree, that is also saying something about the class background and the lack of capital for that very same group. So Trump was able to mobilize the working class, the service class, and those without little to no capital. And here I'm already saying it's both financial, economic capital, and cultural capital that they are lacking. So the poor, the working poor, and the struggling lower class, including the unemployed, who were the victims of deindustrialization in the Rust Belt, fell for him, the rich guy. This cartoon at the bottom, I think, captures this alliance between him and white, predominantly male working class Americans. This segment of the population rallies behind him, and he is able to fire up his base as he does in the photo on the left. And he appeals to the people, ordinary Americans, via his upbeat campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," MAGA, which promises strength and power to those who have many reasons to feel insecure. So this collective boost of self-esteem and the promise that you will become great again if you vote for me is a vital promise and key to his campaign strategy. The other component of his strategy, as you know, is to assault his opponent and instill fear. The tweet here says, "He will take your jobs," that is Biden, "your jobs away, take your guns away, and make you pay more taxes." So this is slightly a distorted account of Biden's political position, or maybe very abbreviated, and it, once again, aims at firing up his base. And how does he do that? How does he energize and mobilize people to support him? Well, as a reality TV host, he has the ability to control and shape a narrative, even if it's not true, like overestimating turnout at one of his rallies early in 2017. He just says things with authority and strength. And he uses brash, harsh language. So rhetorics and habitus are really important for his ability to win over certain states that used to be democratic. So what's there to say about his rhetorics? Well, you all remember his statements from the last campaign, which were very explicit. He was repeatedly talking about the establishment as being something awful. Drain the swamp was one of his incantations, and he referred to the Democratic candidate as Crooked Hillary, and made many other outrageous and aggressive statements that one had not expected in 2015, that someone who made such vulgar claims and insulted vulnerable groups, such as immigrants, or who would even make insulting remarks about women, would be able to make it to the White House. But this is what he said, and this is well known by now, but here it is precisely the populist rhetoric that is so important for his appeal. So it's the racist statement about the Mexicans and that unbelievable statement about women. So it's the contempt, it's the bitterness, and it's the aggressive tone that drives his anti-establishment, pro-ordinary people stance. Now, why? You might wonder. Was he able to win apart from words and attitude and tweets and whatnot, many of which were quite contestable? The larger picture, I believe, you will miss if you don't account for what was happening in the economy. So although this was a time 8 years after the financial crisis, when the economy had recovered somewhat, but the consequences of the recession back then in 16 were still affecting and hurting the bottom segment of the society. In 2016, millions of downwardly mobile working class and rural voters decided to vote for the only change candidate left standing. Everyone was shocked and surprised about the unexpected victory of someone who was really a political outsider and didn't have much experience whatsoever. Now, since then, a host of scholars and pundits tried to explain why Trump was able to win the white working class over to his side, and why the Democrats lost working class voters, because they were ultimately, the voters, disillusioned with the Democratic Party. The Democrats were unable to speak to that segment of the population. That's something that Biden is trying to change now. So, but that back then, Trump was able to mobilize them due to his gift also for reading his audience and delivering strong messages that appealed to their affect more than to rational reasoning. For a billionaire to appeal to the bottom segment of society is a feat. However, to dismiss his campaign and his remarkable achievement of seducing this group by suggesting that those who voted Republican in 2016 did so because they were racist, sexist, stupids, or whatever, that is way too simplistic. People were suffering, and people were desperate, and there still are. I know that, and I've read a lot of accounts of pundits and commentators who refute that economic distress was a major cause of Trump's victory, but his appeal to the downwardly mobile is, I think, crucial to understand Trump's success in 2016 and his conceivable failure in 2020. So, I'm saying it has a lot to do with the economy and particularly inequality. I know I don't have to convince you. You in the audience are aware of the fact that inequality exists. Not everyone thinks so, but the September 2019, the Census Bureau reported that income inequality in the United States had reached its highest level in 50 years, with the Gini index increasing up to 0.43. So Gini, that's the economists' way of measuring inequality, and that 1 means total inequality and 0 would be no inequality at all. So what we get, here's just one chart. I don't want to bombard you with data, but it does help to look into, let's say, Pew Research supporting that very claim that income inequality, it says, in the US is rising. And secondly, as you read below, and it's the highest among the G7 countries. So compared to other countries such as Germany, the US is up, high up. And in fact, it's 1.5 times as likely for someone to be upwardly mobile who lives in Germany than it is to someone who is living in the States. So that has changed since the golden years of the American dream. And that's important. These are numbers, but the thought bubble should remind you that there is so much more involved than graphs and numbers and poverty. I mean, yes, 1 in 5 children lives in poverty. And yes, we could now talk about differences in income inequality and wealth inequality and wage inequality and living wages and poverty wages and da-da-dum. I'm not going to do that. Rather, I now want to pick up on the title of my lecture, the phrase about the rising death toll. Wolfgang Hochbrook mentioned that there's maybe a pessimistic touch to where we are right now. There's certainly a grim undertone to anyone talking about death, and it's maybe a taboo topic, but we need to address that. And here I'm not addressing the obvious, what every one of you is now thinking about, that is the rising death toll of people dying from COVID-19. That is well known, and Trump's mismanagement of the pandemic might even cost him the election. But the rising death toll that I'm interested in the context of this talk, is of a slightly different kind. And this explains, I think, Trump's popularity with blue-collar Americans and those he himself once called the forgotten Americans. Why forgotten? Because the economically marginalized had been neglected and their suffering was not sufficiently addressed by the Democrats. And they paid the price for it, losing the election. But that is still the case. People at the bottom are on dire straits. They are suffering and they are neglected. A large segment of the population has experienced foreclosures. That's the term for when you as a house owner have to sell your house under value because you can't pay off the mortgage. Or millions have been evicted, and millions are addicted. Addiction to drugs and the opioid crisis is a social reality that we have to, particularly if you're in the field of American studies, face, as sad as it is. Because the destitution in 2016 existed, and in spite of him saying the economy is great, the destitution has exacerbated. Again, Trump support grew out of the misery of the downwardly mobile working class, facing job loss, declining lifespans, and hopelessness. Their economic grievances were real, while some clinged on to the authoritarian leader, with the strong words, who promised them jobs and great lives. Others were literally giving up. Their sense of despair then leads to drug and alcohol use and rising suicide rates. Now this, I find, is one of the most shocking and horrendous facts about contemporary America. The mortality rate among middle-aged white Americans who decided to end their lives by suicide or through addiction has risen dramatically. These deaths by despair, by suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholism are committed by predominantly less educated white male Americans. So the original concept of death of despair stems from economist and Case and Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton, whose book, Death of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, came out this year by Princeton University. It examines the rising mortality among non-degree or below BA degree holding Americans living disproportionately in lower rural communities, whose despair was a product of the long-term and economic and social decline. So they are making an argument that is in fitting with the overall topic of today's lecture, and they are naming inequality, urbanization, globalization, and the educational divide, and the inadequate U.S. health system to be the main 5 factors for the economic decline and then also the rising mortality rate. So those who feel left behind take it out on themselves, but the reason for their despair, and that's important, is structural. Deaton and Case argue, quote, capitalism is no longer delivering. Capitalism, which over the 2 centuries lifted countless people out of poverty, is now destroying the lives of blue-collar America, end of quote. Due to the growing power of corporations and a ravenous healthcare system, working-class wages are redistributed into the pockets of the wealthy. So inequality and the income gap is directly related to their demise. Now that sounds maybe to some of you like left rhetoric, but the misery of the underclass is perhaps more real or felt when we look at those who are alive and have to struggle to stay alive. So, what do I mean? Yes, there is hunger in America. People go hungry every day. So, and it's not 1 million, it's not 10 million, it's like 40 million. And that was before COVID, 40 million, and the quite shocking number below, that 40% of mothers with children, so single mothers, are food insecure. That's another term that comes up in the scholarly literature. So they're not like hungry every night, but they just never know where the next meal is coming from, and they rarely get nutritious stuff. So another sad reality, but that is part of the picture and has a lot to do with what's going to happen on Tuesday. In the US, this year, over 2 million more households claim that they do not have enough to eat, writes The Economist, the magazine. Now, since the pandemic, 1 in 5 African American households is going hungry. Next, talking about this year and the age of COVID. In 2020, in the US, how do the top 1% fare? What is that they're having? Well, they're having more as ever. The fortunes of the top 5 billionaires rose by 102 billion, insane amount, this year. 5 people, increasing their wealth by 26%. So they are making investments, probably at the stock market, or working with whatever deals, they maybe owning a mask company or something else, investing in health or the pharmaceutical industry, whatever they did. Those 5 people, total asset comes to $3.5 trillion. You know, that's an amount I can't even imagine, fathom. Does that fit in this room? You know, yeah. But they have it, and the rest doesn't. That would drive me insane as well, particularly if you're scraping to get by. And I've visited some of the people and did volunteer work, who were part of that community. And, you know, they're doing all they can to get by. But here, the inequality, once again, has been indecent. You know, it's accelerated. It's like beyond words. I don't even know what the rich do with that money, but this is where we are at. It's more divided economically than it has ever been. So the COVID-19 pandemic that we are in right now has exacerbated economic inequality. The pandemic has had a devastating impact on poverty levels. Well, not only stating the fact that that is the case, but you might also ask yourself, why is that the case? Well, the answer is easy. One is that higher paid workers are working from home. Lower paid blue-collar workers typically don't have that option. They're often laid off. And also low-paid workers in service jobs or essential service jobs such as nursing, teaching, cleaning, or even store attendants and waitresses are more likely to come into contact with people who are infected. And others working in services are at a higher risk to lose their job. By October 2020, so this month, 66 million people filed for unemployment, I learned. So, and it's particularly women, alongside with the poor, elderly, disabled, African Americans, and the migrant populations who have borne the brunt of economic consequences from the pandemic. So here we are. What I have tried to explain so far is inequality, and without using the term precarity, I have tried to illustrate the precarious state of America. The term precarity is well established in the sociology and political science, in economy, in cultural studies, in psychology, in various fields, and it is precisely to name what is linked to inequality. That is, inequality is not just the gap, the divide, but it means that the bottom lives precarious lives, economically and also otherwise. They're insecure, job insecure. So economic insecurity is probably the most general definition of precarity. And when Pierre Bourdieu used the term back in 1999, saying we are all precarious, he was hinting at something that has become a reality now, that more and more people are part of the precariat, that group of people who are struggling. And it's a new normal. It's due to what's called precarization, that process. It becomes ever more common, even amongst academics. And what is really important, but what I cannot go into for reasons of time because it's so complex, is that this is not just happening out of nowhere. This is a systemic effect of a particular kind of capitalism that people refer to as neoliberal capitalism, or some even use the term precarity capitalism. I wrote a book about this, Wolfgang Hochbrook mentioned it, and it's entitled Inequality, Poverty, and Precarity in Contemporary America, and it came out in 2016, so I wrote the introduction 2 days after the outcome of the last election, and you can imagine how that felt, because in that book I talk about the rising awareness for an income inequality in America. And back then I was optimistic that the awareness about income inequality would make a difference, but I was taught otherwise. With hindsight, we know that that did not change much. To the contrary, it got worse. So the intervention by scholars and pundits drawing attention to the economic suffering of the many was not heard, or it had no political effect. So why did the inequality debate fail? Well, it did not reach out to precisely those Americans who felt they were left behind. Many of the non-college educated voters, particularly those living in rural areas, felt a greater affinity for Trump, I said this, allowing him to get the piece of the pie, or the pie. And at the time, the pollsters were all wrong, predicting a Democratic win. And I recall when Trump gave his first speech in the White House, right at the day of his inauguration. And it was an interview. It was not a speech, it was an interview on January the 20th, 2017, and he began by thanking his supporters. Under my administration, these forgotten men and women are forgotten no longer. He knew it. It was strategic, it was willed. And for Trump to use the same term Franklin Roosevelt had famously deployed in the 1930s during the Great Depression is amazing. Franklin talked about those who, the third of the population that is ill-clad, ill-fed, and struggling. So, to better understand his appeal, and we are still trying to chew that and think through what's going on here, it is not enough to consider the socioeconomic realities. We'll have to address the dialectic of populism and polarization. So let's begin with populism. Here in red, Trump embodies the rise of populism. He's one of the big populists in the world. And he owes his presidency to the support from populist voters, and his fervent rhetoric still inflames populist sentiments. So, why is there populism in the U.S.? I am sure that some of you have an answer to this question. How is it possible that all of a sudden in the last 10 years we have all these men, Erdogan, Orban, Trump, taking over the stage? Well, I don't know for the other nations, but for the US, I want to propose 3 causes. Yes, I do think economic insecurity is one reason, because the consequences of profound changes transforming the workforce and society in a post-industrial neoliberal economy created economic insecurity across the board. That's the precarity argument. And this is not something that started in 2016. It has a long history. It's a long socioeconomic process that was going on that augmented and led to economic inequality and insecurity. But it's not just that. The cultural backlash thesis, I believe, is very convincing. I'm a cultural studies professor, so yes. That support can be explained as a strong reaction by once dominant, maybe hegemonic, sectors of the population to now more progressive values. And this cultural shift that has also a long, long, long history, starting even in the 70s up to today, and that includes more and more tolerance for people who are different, and more individualism. Singularisierung is Reckwit's term, which I also like, although his focus is on Europe, but it is also helpful to think this through Reckwit's thesis. But the combination of the two, economy and cultural change, amounts to the rise of populism. So it's class and culture. Defining characteristics, those 3. If I had to single out 3, then I'd say it's them, you see here. And the article that I feel does a lot of justice to this was published by Engelhard Norris. It's really brilliant, and they have this to say. We argue that the classic economic left-right cleavage in party competition is overlaid today by a new cultural cleavage dividing populists from cosmopolitan liberalism. Okay, what's happening here? We have populism, and the antithesis are the cosmopolitan liberal people living in the cities, are for pluralism, are for tolerance, are for what was once called multiculturalism, and they are for progressive in the sense of values that embrace openness, for example. Populists embrace something that is more an exclusive attitude, whereas others are more inclusive. But that dynamic is also related to the opposition of right and left, because populism, as we know it, right-wing populism, often correlates with an economic policy that is in favor of deregulation, market capitalism as we know it, etc. Whereas left side of the spectrum is a little bit more for regulation, economic, now I have to read it myself, the welfare and collectivism, they call it. We will look into this a little bit further, but that was enough for now, on the role of populism to understand Trump's victory, but also where the inequality intersects with populism. Next is polarization. Now, this is something that is important in the context of this lecture series, and I want to address this now head on. But before I do this, I will give you a 2-minute break. So if you need to grab something to drink or do whatever, please, or just shake up or close your eyes or take notes, something. We are through with the first part of the lecture, and that's it. Here we are, back again. Why don't you just shake up one last time, and now we go. Polarization, yes, this is a perfect illustration of what's going on. We have blue America, red America, the donkey, and the elephant. and they are in their own little worlds, own little bubbles. If I had found another image where those two heads were head to head and really banging their heads against each other, I would have chosen that one. But this is a good start by way of illustrating, here it is, illustrating, what's going on. Yeah? Now, what's this thing, polarization, that everyone talks about? It's really blowing up. It's all over the media. Boom! Each year we become more fractured and more polarized. Hear that daunting undertone? Dun, 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 dun. Is America hopelessly polarized or just allergic to politics? Okay, whatever that is, allergy. How Americans were driven to extremes. So it's not just polarity, it's extremes. Why can't we get along? What is the true cost of polarization in America? That's a good one. What's the true cost? Yeah, they're telling us. It's the mentality of government shutdowns, not lockdowns, shutdowns, gridlock, and segregation, and lying. So, and Ezra Klein's podcast is something I recommend. I would rather recommend his book, Why We Are Polarized, which is a really bestseller on this topic. So across the board, from pundits to scholars to the media, it is everywhere. What is it? Definition 1, sorting by political issues. Very simply, and that's something positive, we have Democrats believing in certain political agendas and policies, whereas Republicans believe in something else. And what are those issues? I imagine you're all aware. It's often about social welfare, government health insurance, tax cuts, minimum wage, environmental issues, and now fracking, where the two diverge significantly. But also race is a key divisive issue, because some, that is mostly Democrats, support civil rights, racial equality, immigration, affirmative action. And the Republicans right now have their own views on this matter. Abortion is one of those hot bottom issues par excellence. Sexuality, meaning diversity and sexuality and openness to different styles of love, is also, versus homophobic attitudes. You know, those issues are commonly used as the battleground on which to butt heads. Gun control, biggie. Now here are the most contested issues. Let's go down the list. It's abortion, yes, it's gender and queer and LGBTQAI plus community, yes, it's the Second Amendment, yes, it's immigration and the wall, yes, a recent divisive moment was Kaepernick protesting against racial inequality and unjust treatment of African Americans during Black Lives Matter, and Trump's comments on that, and whether this lack of patriotism is acceptable or needs to be criticized. Those issues have really fueled what is to a certain degree necessary for a democracy to happen, to have two sides. But these were the hot button issues. But it's not only about things and policies and matters, but it's also about party affiliation. So, as you see, I indicated who is tends to be in favor of what political, racial, and cultural issue. So Trump and Biden starkly diverge on crucial issues such as fracking and fossil fuel. So Biden doesn't want the federal subsidies to continue. He wants to support wind and solar energy. So that's a statement right there. When it comes to the economy, Trump wants the tax cuts that he already put through, and Biden comes down on a different end of the spectrum. So he wants to raise minimum wages, which is something that Trump doesn't want. And on Corona, they certainly also diverge big time. So Trump's saying, it's only going, it will be going, whatever that was. He says it'll go away soon, in weeks, and Biden says we will experience a dark winter. So that ideological divide is lending itself to party affiliation, and there's also a predictability. So if you are in favor of gun control, then you lean towards a specific camp. And those camps can be referred to by different labels. Right, left, emphasis on maybe the economy. Conservative versus liberal, values, lifestyle. Party affiliations, Republican versus Democrats. And in the scholarly literature, I also found interesting assessments about orthodox versus progressive. Orthodox meaning not only religious, but also your old, family model, father knows best kind of world and ideology, versus something that is more attuned with the progressive cosmopolitan spirit. Another opposition is here that I find helpful: traditionalism versus progressivism. And really, in this heated debate, what is negotiated tacitly is also the question of social change. Which direction are we going in? That value system of, let's say, the 70s and 80s that sometimes Trump embraces, as opposed to something else. I really like this distinction that David Barker and Lillian Mason, both professors, and he is the director of the Center of Election Studies. Can you imagine that? And they are pretty acute when they are suggesting that we should look at, firstly, polarization referring to the disagreement over issues. That is something I covered already, and that is in many ways healthy and important. Then there is, secondly, another kind of polarization they refer to as affective polarization. So what does that mean? So it's not just about politics, it's about affect. Affective polarization refers to the extent to which citizens feel more negatively, often, towards other political parties than towards their own. So the in-group bias is really at the core here. Indeed, in this context, affect refers predominantly to negative feelings and antagonizing views against people who hold opposing views. And, there are all these polls that really a majority of the Republicans don't want their children to marry a member of that other political party. And they don't have neighbors or friends who are from that other side. So everyone is sticking to his or her own little island. So this is part of what scholars refer to as affective or partisan polarization, those two terms. But other terms that are linked to this are tribalism. That makes sense because those two are tribes who like to stick to themselves as such. And let's maybe leave it at that. We will come back to the vitriol and the negativity in a moment and move on to what you don't see as much in the journalistic accounts, the factual polarization, the post-factual component. So what's that? What do they mean by that? It's the fake news is one, post-truth is another slogan that gets us at the fact that, and here the media outlets, the TV and the news, 24-hour news programs like NBC News or CNN or Fox News play a big role because they provide a certain knowledge that caters to affective polarization. And they tend to downplay the other side. So there is a strong bias, and this is not only about the social thing, but it's also about knowledge production in general. So the ability to choose media that is aligned with my belief and that presents or misrepresents the facts in a certain way leads to greater biases about relevant facts. So due to factual polarization, they say this, the one group, they say that, the one other group. It becomes ever more difficult to get at the core of the matter. I don't know. I've myself felt like that often. It's like, okay, so what's true? There's that, that's plausible, there's this, and how do you figure out where the figure in the carpet and how it all comes together? Here, the argument about the echo chambers comes in because if we select the media that suits our views, we will reconfirm the beliefs we had in the first place. So one example is this past week after the presidential debate, I read the New York Times report on it and learned that Biden was the stronger opponent and Trump being unable to explain in clear terms what he would hope to do with another 4 years in the White House. Biden, for his part, so the New York Times, stuck to the core of the argument that propelled his campaign from the start. He made no serious error, supporting the view that Biden engaged in no wrongdoing over his son's business dealings. So the New York Times implicitly presented Biden as the winner of the debate. And Fox News is saying that Trump beat Biden, end of quote. He won on points and managed to bring up the scandal over Hunter Biden's shady foreign businesses. And Biden lied about this and that and the other. And Biden denied wrongdoings. So it's really not red and blue. It's like two, if you were to look at this wall and two people see different things in it, or one is saying it's red and the other says it's purple. So here factual, ideological, and affective components of polarization come together. Now, let's finish off with a fourth type of polarization that they call intransigence. So what's that? It's like a stubbornness that refers to when you're not willing to cooperate at all. So that would be a form of extreme partisanship or hyper-partisanship or, extreme tribalism. And that is also extremely emotionally charged. And that also exceeds the political realm and spills over into the social realm, not just media. So polls have shown that 58 Republicans have very unfavorable views towards Democrats, and 55% find Republicans very unfavorable. So they don't like each other, right? So what happens if we transfer the sense of hyper-partisanship, or negative partisanship, another word, that often leads to hot rage, to the streets? Well, this brings us here. And this is a representation of polarization that I like to take a minute to share with you what's going on here. And now I do what people in my field like to do like a close reading of what you see right in front of you. So this is a picture that speaks more than 1,000 words. I invite you to take a minute to analyze this photo. It's taken at the Republican National Convention protest rally in Charlotte, North Carolina, in August this year. Think about it. Well, it certainly illustrates polarization, depicting a clash between protesters and counter-protesters, Republicans and properly Democrats. It's a news photo accompanying an article entitled "The Consequences of Dehumanizing Language in Politics." That is, it is illustrating that harsh, cruel attitude towards the other side, negative partisanship. And in this case, probably also hate speech. Because here the two sides are literally head to head. I don't know what they're saying, on what issues they disagree. However, there is a lot of rage and also a visceral reaction. Both are high-strung and furious. Their veins are intense, the lips turned upwards. What else do you see? Well, we assume that one man is black and one is white. Doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but I believe that most of us would think so. And so this also illustrates racial polarization, something that is so pertinent that I will come back to it in a minute. So bodily characteristics are also pronounced. One is skinny, one is heavy. One might be a vegetarian, the other a meat eater, maybe. Maybe a biker versus a bicyclist. This is all conjecture, yes, but this is about social and cultural reality, not just political identity. So it is also probably about two kinds of masculinity. And then there is possibly the so-called diploma divide, which Alexander Theodoridis, who teaches at Amherst, argues in his accompanying article. It is an important factor, that very diploma divide, in political polarization. Indeed, here we might have a self-identified redneck, that does exist, and maybe a college graduate who might have, like most of his classmates, a humongous student loan to pay back. Maybe he is on the edge not only because he's angry at the men on the other side facing him, but also because he is himself, the African-American gentleman, financially insecure. Possibly we have two people who are themselves struggling now, taking it out on themselves. Possibly one lives in town in North Carolina, whereas the other lives in the state capital, Charlotte. Maybe the other lives in the outskirts or in a small town like, there is this word or label for this town, Hickory Grove, North Carolina. So what I'm saying is the geographical polarization is playing also into the topic. And it is illustrated right here. Now, the T-shirt is saying trust, and that is a punctum, to use a phrase that Roland Barthes came up with that I like so much, because that really draws our attention to one little detail in this particular image. And it sticks out, and it demands our attention. Why is this a telling punctum detail? Because it makes explicit the consequences of affective polarization. In the long run, it corrodes trust. Dislike leads to distrust, prejudice leads to violence. And this ongoing confrontation between red and blue Americans could fuel long-lasting schisms. So if you look at this, you get the sense that polarization is not going to go away next week or anytime soon. What's also fascinating about this picture is the people in the background. Yes, it is COVID times. Yes, we see also regarding masks a polarization, that some protect themselves using them and others are still insisting that they want to be free. And there's also a gender bias to that divide, by the way. So fascinating, right? Liberals tend to protect themselves, some Republicans don't, and men sometimes, and I could bring you or quote a few statements saying that they felt constrained by it, or some sergeant saying, I'm not a pussy, I'm not wearing a mask. All these charged symbolism in the context of polarization might be something that we can tease out from our analysis of just this one picture. I'll stop here and come back to the trust issue in a bit, but we'll sum up the causes of polarization. And here we have, as you see, economic inequality, identity threats, and status anxieties, that the lower class is also culturally losing status and left behind, partisanship, the us versus them attitude that exacerbates and that the media also fires up constantly. So the media bubbles, the echo chambers, some listening to that outlet, others to that outlet, that exacerbates it. And yes, social media, that's an argument that's familiar to all of you, is also enhancing this trend of polarization due to the echo chambers and also the algorithms that are feeding us with the ever same. So I like the kind of formula that was shared by on this website, Congregational Consulting, economic inequality plus identity threat plus articulated grievance. Grievance, again, is justified. They have a reason to grieve, and that amounts to polarization. Well, that's a nice little calculus. So we are coming to social media and the end of trust. this is a really strong statement that Friedman made in the New York Times, and I want you to read it on your own because it's so long, but I think you will just say yes. So factual polarization is something that he also brings up, and that is maybe also one of the more grim messages, that collectively there is something happening where people disconnect more and more. You can't like really trust people anymore. There is this invisible wall, veil separating people. Polarization and social media and other factors play into it. But I think this is something that maybe many of us feel. And now, what's the consequence if that goes to extremes, the destruction of trust? Well, it can get grueling, because if the fourth form, the intransigence, is not just about hate speech, but also about taking to the guns and violence in the streets, like it happened here with this couple in St. Louis, where they were outside of their home protecting it with guns in June, when in the incidents of Black Lives Matter, they felt threatened by these young people. That, to me, also captures the inexorable, merciless aggression of ordinary middle-class Americans who might not be economically insecure. Spurred affect, polarized citizens condemned Black Americans, the left elite, and raised cancel culture, a brutalizing ideology against those who are perceived as different and debased as enemies. The dystopian vision is the next civil war, and here we have the coming civil war in the yellow cover. Then there is the German book that came out, Amerika im Kalten Bürgerkrieg, so it's already happening, is Lütjen's argument, wie ein Land seine Mitte verliert. But the most powerful contribution on this matter is this podcast. It could happen here, where the podcast host lays out a somewhat realistic and plausible scenario that we could actually see more violence and militia being active on the part of the maybe losing president. Let's stop with this negative outcome, and I want to share for a minute before we come to a conclusion another response to this polarization that is not as, let me see if I can make this happen, aggressive. So we are fiddling with this. It's video by an artist, and it was on This American Life, and it's entitled Seriously. So if you want to listen to it another time, so Leslie Odom, and I might not start at the beginning, but take you to the spot later on, right here.
Is this the best we can do? Seriously. Let's talk of fear. Why don't bring it in here? It's a dangerous word. Spooks the herd and we all bleed in the stampede. Fear makes a false friend indeed. And I take it seriously. Oh, hear me now. For the truth gets drowned out by a demigod fixing, a demigod fixing, tease history repeating. Angry, am I angry? You ask, am I angry? And I had a lost for. After all we've done, every battle hard won, every head on great, in the name of this place, in a history place, with incredible mistakes. And I pledge my allegiance to these united, divided states.
Okay. So I couldn't have said it better. I think there's a lot in here which we are not going to analyze, but instead I will then end up on Trumpism, which is a term that you might have come across to, we're coming full circle, indicate what Trump stood for, hopefully. This is a cartoon that really captures Trump's America sarcastically, but maybe also realistically, because just to take up one snippet out of the many that are on the ground in his locker room, the racism. I mean, it's obvious, we talked about it, but it's really also another significant factor next to class, next to gender, that I can't elaborate on today because I want to let you enjoy your evening in a minute or two. But Ta-Nehisi Coates' statement, Trump is the first white president, is really perceptive. That is really important, that he emphasized whiteness and rejected people of color. And Paul Gilroy, a long time ago, said something very prescient, that race, in this later phase in which we're in right now, is aligned with nationhood, patriotism, and nationalism, America first. Homogeneous in its whiteness, yet precarious and perpetually vulnerable to attack from enemies. So whiteness is under attack, but that leads, unfortunately, to dehumanizing blacks and not to rebel against the structural causes for polarization and populism. Trump's statement about the losers, referring to patriots who gave their lives, and even to Bush and McCain, that's far beyond any logic that a president would say something like this, and it's only because of his narcissistic personality. And I think that is really absurd. Now, the counter movements against, the political situation in the US is indeed a dark and explosive one. However, while the vicious circles we discussed tonight are pushing forward the ill effects of precarity, inequality, populism, and polarization, there is more than just a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Other gears are also currently already in motion. The counter-movements against Trump that could reverse the damage of these cycles are not a naive dream of the future, but rather groups acting now. Voter suppression has been met with a surge of campaigns succeeding in voter empowerment. Systemic racism and violence have united previously separate groups to bring awareness and social change. The rise of right-wing populism has given rise to a counter-movement on the left. The threat of climate crisis and the push to ignore signs for economic gain has engendered a whole new generation of politicians, AOC, one of them, interested in understanding signs and reversing the crisis. Decades of gender-based oppression is being dismantled by emboldened women in queer communities. I believe we will see Biden win, and after all of this right-wing populism, we will see some changes might be made by voting rights activists, by civil rights movements, left populism even, changes in congressional politics, the work of feminists, and groups championed for the rights of LGBTQIA+ people. American people have been working harder than ever in response to this, one of the darker moments in American history. With them and similar movements around the world lies the dawning of maybe a better moment ahead of us. Thank you for listening. Good night. These are the works cited lists just for you to look at if you have the PowerPoint and